All right, welcome back. Chapter 17, part 3. So finishing this up, this one's not a very long video. So we are here. Did that. Okay. Estrogen and progesterone also responsible for a changes in shape to the pelvic girdle. So in females, as you might know, just looking at the physique of a male and female, that the pelvic girdle is wider and deeper in females, and that's going to allow for that larger pelvic cavity because if you're carrying a child, you're going to need that space in that pelvic cavity. In a male, you're going to see that those iliac bones are going to be more forward facing, so thinking about those hip bones, and not so wide and not so deep. The other thing that we notice is that the female pelvis tilts forward, so females tend to have more of a lower back curve than males, and so you're going to have more of a protruding butt or an obvious buttocks. Okay, so what happens with these hormones as we get older? So menopause essentially is when the ovarian cycle ceases and it is no longer responding to gonadotropic hormones. So that gonadotropin releasing hormone is not going to be stimulated or made by the hypothalamus. So we're not going to have the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, and follow suit FSH or LH, follicle stimulating or luteinizing hormone. So generally what happens is that menstruation becomes irregular, become longer, shorter, and then essentially then there is an absence of menstruation for a year, and then you might be termed being in menopause. It's always a good idea to get a blood test to ensure that that's actually the case, because there could be other reasons why a woman is not menstruating. It could be diet, health issues. She could in fact be pregnant. So it's always a good idea to get a blood test. All right, so I mentioned earlier that if there is a fertilized egg that's implanting into the uterus, progesterone is going to be helping out because it's going to keep the uterine lining intact for long enough, and you need like 10 days of that, at least 10 days, so that that fertilized egg can make it from the oviduct, travel down the oviduct or the uterine horn into the uterus and implant. So it takes some time. If it implants into the uterus, it essentially is going to signal the release of human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. So that's what a pregnancy test tests for. So if you buy over-the-counter test kit, it's testing for HCG. So essentially, the rising amounts of HCG stimulate the corpus luteum to keep on producing progesterone, and eventually it's going to not matter whether the corpus luteum is actually making that progesterone, because the placenta is going to take over making that as well as estrogen, and then that corpus luteum is just going to shrink and then be reabsorbed by the body. So here we see, again, our ovarian cycle and our uterine cycle, taking a look at these hormone levels. So ovulation occurred and progesterone increased. It must have been that she was sexually active around ovulation. So really you're thinking 24 hours before or after ovulation. And that egg was fertilized and it implanted in the uterus. And when it did, it started making HCG, which essentially was keeping the corpus luteum intact for a certain amount of time until that, we go back to the previous slide, until the placenta itself is going to release the progesterone and estrogen, so that ensures that that uterine lining is not going to be lost. Because if a woman's luteal phase, that's this time necessary for the uterine lining to hang around post-ovulation. So if her luteal phase is too short and she's essentially, the progesterone is crashing too early, then she might actually be expelling a fertilized egg that did not have enough time to fully implant in the uterus. So I did want to mention birth control pills. There's, certainly all kinds of contraception. But what's happening with birth control pills, now that you know so much about hormones, is essentially they are keeping progesterone and estrogen high, and it might depend on whether you're on a progesterone only or estrogen only birth control pill. But if you're on like a triphasic type of pill, which is trying to mimic your normal cycle, then you're going to see that it's going to keep that estrogen and progesterone high so that no follicles mature. Now, if you're taking a pack, it's a 28-day pack, and the first 5 days are placebo, then essentially what's happening, it starts here. These are placebo pills just to keep you in the habit of taking your pills the whole 28 days, but essentially this is when you're releasing the uterine lining from the previous uterine cycle, and excuse me. And then by the time that your body would be making the FSH and LH, and it would be triggering the ovaries to do their thing, well, you've started progesterone and estrogen again in your pills, so that elevates those hormones and fakes out your ovaries not to make any egg cells. Okay, that's the end of chapter 17, part 3. Study guide 5 is next, and it's all about ecology and the environment. I'll see you again soon.